Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob Cywes, and today we're going to discuss a very common general surgical procedure. In fact, one of the things that got me interested in the whole dietary carbohydrate addiction concept in the early 1990s, um, and that is gallbladder disease. And specifically, there's a number of things that can happen with the gallbladder. You've got cancer, you've got a variety of other things. We're going to talk about gallbladder sludge and gallbladder stones and cholecystectomy for cholesterol gallstones. I'm also, as part of this, going to ignore the black stones that we see in the liver that occur mostly from hemoglobin breakdown. I'm going to ignore those hemosiderin stones. So we'll focus on cholesterol gallstones. And in fact, in the early, in the late 1990s, I had a young child, a 14-year-old boy who weighed over 400 pounds. And he came to us with acute cholecystitis, which was unheard of in the pediatric community. And we ended up taking his gallbladder out, and it was the early stages of laparoscopic surgery. And I was very proud I could do his operation laparoscopically in such a big kid. But you know what? I had no idea about why he became fat and how to help him with his obesity. 14 years old, over 400 pounds. And that's where my interest turned into the obesity and the ketogenic and the carbohydrate addiction side. But that's for another day. The point is that this kid had gallstones. And watching what this guy ate, the common theory at the time was that it was fat, in particular saturated fat, because saturated fat was the demon of the medical world from the 1970s through to today. The common theory was that it was chronic excessive saturated fat consumption and the fat in our diet and the amount of cholesterol we ate in our diet. Remember how bad eggs used to be? All the foods that contained contained cholesterol caused supersaturation of cholesterol in the bile and caused gallstones. Well, that theory is absolutely 100% false. And what's interesting is that earlier on, before I got to take this kid's gallbladder out, and I got to see what he was eating, and he was eating 80-90% of his food that he was eating was carbohydrates, junk, sugar and starch. It wasn't fat. Yeah, there was some fat in the donuts he was eating, but it was predominantly carbohydrates. And I looked at this and I said, if he's eating a ton of sugar, he's not eating a lot of fat, how can fat be responsible for his cholesterol gallstones? Now, the other part also is that I did my Ph.D., which I'm very proud of over here. I did my Ph.D. looking at sugar in livers, but I did it with a guy, a phenomenal mentor for me, a guy by the name of Steve Strasberg, up in Toronto at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. He's now working in St. Louis at Washington University, but he was a cholesterol expert, a surgeon who was a cholesterol expert. And they worked at why do we get these stones and what's happening in bile, but the entire foundation, the backbone of their theory was based on the consumption of fat and cholesterol in our diet, which even the Dietary Guidelines Committee kind of have acknowledged is not that important. In fact, it's irrelevant, but kind of isn't important because about a third to a half of the cholesterol in our body comes from what we eat. About half to two-thirds of the cholesterol in our body gets produced internally. And every single cell, nearly every single cell in the human body produces cholesterol. And the biggest producer of cholesterol is the liver. The brain, and the adrenal glands, because they're steroid hormones. So anywhere you've got steroid hormones produce a ton of cholesterol. But cholesterol is produced in every cell in the human body and is an integral part of the cell membrane. But the greatest place that the liver produces cholesterol is in the liver. And the way cholesterol production works under normal circumstances is that cholesterol production, there's many enzymes involved, but cholesterol production works in a negative feedback system. So when your cholesterol levels are low, there's certain triggering pathways of what we call regulating proteins that get upregulated and the body produces more cholesterol. And then as more cholesterol gets produced, there is a deregulation. There's another system, a negative feedback system, that deregulates these regulatory proteins. And the protein mechanism of regulation and deregulation, the regulating protein, is a protein called SPEBP, and it regulates the production and the elevation or decrease in production of cholesterol. Okay. Now remember that you don't have to know the names. SPEBP. I know the name, but it doesn't sit in my head. But I know the concept. So what happens is the majority of the cholesterol gets produced in the body, in the liver, gets transported around the body, gets converted into steroid hormones, gets used for cell membranes, and a significant amount of that cholesterol is secreted into bile. Why? Because bile acids are essential to the absorption of fat from our diet. Okay, they form these micelles, little bubbles of soap that are filled with bile. Because remember, fat, especially long chain fat, is hydrophobic. It doesn't like water, so it's got to be imported in these bubbles that go into the lymphatic system. And actually, fat and fat-soluble vitamins don't go straight to the liver. They actually dump into the blood system through the thoracic duct that empties into the left neck. And so it's a systemic circulation that goes straight to the fat cells as well as the liver, not through the liver to the rest of the body. An interesting little conundrum there. And the bile acids flow from the liver into the intestine and flow through the intestine, combine with fat at the time of a meal. So you need bile acids for a meal. So what happens is, instead of this just flowing out of the liver into the intestine all the time, the body's very smart, the human body. Not all animals have a gallbladder, but what happens is the liver is continuously producing bile. The bile then goes into this little bag on the edge of the bile duct called the gallbladder. And the gallbladder concentrates the bile, gets rid of some of the fluid from the bile, and then when you have a fatty meal, there's a hormone called cholecystokinin that gets released by the stomach and the pancreas early on in the consumption of saturated fat, and the gallbladder squeezes, and it squeezes bile into the intestine in response to this fatty meal, and then through the intestine you can break down and absorb that fat because the little soap bubbles are right there. And then what happens is that bile gets absorbed in the terminal ileum, the end of the small bowel, and gets circulated back. It's called the enterohepatic circulation of bile. Gets circulated back to the liver where it gets reused. Beautiful system. Now, a lot of that cholesterol, a lot of that bile does get into the poop. That's actually what makes our poop brown. If you don't have bile, if you've had a blocked bile duct, your poop turns kind of a chalky white color. Be that as it may, a lot of that is excreted, the excess is excreted in the poop. That is the normal healthy system. Now, the theory was that it was the consumption of fat, but the body eats a lot of fat and the body controls fat, and we don't become sick because of saturated fat. We know that, the evidence is there. So there must be something else. And you've heard of the acronym or the little saying of people, the commonest people with gallstones: fair, fat, female, 40, and fertile. It describes a particular demographic of people. Now, I know that that's just the saying that we medical students used to use, so don't go sexist, don't go anything else on me on that. That's how we remember the people with a higher likelihood of gallstones. But really what it is, those people also have something else in common typically. They're also very high consumers of carbohydrates. Okay? So, in fact, it isn't the fat in our diet that is driving this excess of cholesterol. What happens is, remember that negative feedback pathway that controls production? It really isn't about consumption. That's processed. That's processed very, very well. It's about production. And it's so important to understand when you're talking about oxalates, or you're talking about fat, or you're talking about glucose, it's production versus consumption where the difference lies. Another talk. But in the liver, that negative feedback pathway is driven by the SPEBP regulating protein. And what regulates the regulating protein? So cool. A hormone called insulin. A hormone called insulin. And chronically elevated levels of insulin resistance, causes that negative feedback pathway to shut down, where the SPEBP SPEPP protein, the regulating protein, no longer reacts to insulin. So instead of when the cholesterol levels go up, that system shuts down, the cholesterol levels go down, that system is disconnected, it's broken. So you've got this chronic excessive production of cholesterol by the liver in particular, and it's just pouring out tons of cholesterol, lots of substrate, not the fat, but the sugar that gets turned into that cholesterol. And in fact, what's interesting is you've got a byproduct of that sugar production pathway. And that is, in fact, where the statins work to block one of the early products in the cholesterol pathway. They block the rate-limiting step of the cholesterol pathway, that irrevocable step. It's called mallevolate, which is the molecule that gets produced as the precursor to cholesterol. Okay, so follow me along. High cholesterol blocks that negative feedback pathway, so you've got this overproduction, unregulated overproduction of cholesterol. The way the liver copes with that is to pour out more cholesterol into the bile. And some of that cholesterol, the bile now, the bile acids, are conjugated with proteins. That's conjugated bile. Some of them are not conjugated. And they get excreted down that biliary pathway. They get concentrated in the gallbladder, and about 1 gram on average of cholesterol gets excreted by a normal person into their gut. Some people can secrete anywhere from 1 to 5 grams in a day. Massive overproduction of cholesterol. Not harmful, but at least to the general body. But then what happens is that cholesterol undergoes a process called lipid peroxidation, where it gets transformed to what we call oxysteroids. And those are the ones that concentrate in the bile, in the gallbladder. And at high concentrations of what we call supersaturated bile. If you've done chemistry at high school, you know what a supersaturated fluid is. And what happens is that bile then crystallizes, the cholesterol crystallizes out of the bile, forms little crystals. And the crystals amalgamate and form gallstones. So early on, when there's just a bunch of crystals, it's almost like mud. We call that sludge, and you can see gallbladder sludge on an ultrasound. And then it takes years, months and years, to form gallstones. And as the gallstones rub against each other, they form these little round pellets. And when you fracture them, they look just like gemstones, like crystal gemstones. They're beautiful in their formation. Sometimes they can be soft and chalky. Sometimes they can be really hard and crystalline, depending on how long they've been there. Now, the gallstones themselves can cause pain. They can cause discomfort, because then, in response to a fatty meal, when that gallbladder contracts, it hurts. It causes pain. And we call that cholecystitis or cholecystolic pain, because it contracts. And then the gallbladder can get inflamed, especially if bacteria get up. We believe that bacteria can get up from the intestine up the duct into the gallbladder and cause inflammation and infection. That's called cholecystitis, and that's when you're having a gallbladder attack. Now, gallbladder attacks are not by themselves dangerous. They're incredibly painful. But remember, you've got this horrible diseased gallbladder that doesn't really store bile anymore because it's chock-a-block full of stones. And, excuse me, the stones cause already dysfunction of the gallbladder. So by the time you've got gallstones and you've got a gallbladder full of inflamed and a horrible and gruddy looking gallbladder that we see at surgery, that gallbladder is not functional. So don't worry about it producing bile, and it's probably been non-functional for years. I'll circle back to that in a second, because it answers an important question for people after cholecystectomy, after they had their gallbladder come out. Can I eat fat? So that gallbladder gets all chock-a-block full of stones, and when it gets inflamed, you come in with a gallbladder attack, you feel nausea, you may have a bit of a fever from the inflammation, you get the hiccups. It's a miserable feeling, and we get an ultrasound, we see this thickened wall, we see the fluid around the wall, you've got acute cholecystitis, we may cool you down, and then we go and we do the operation laparoscopically, because the only cure for that is to take out the factory of the gallstones to do a cholecystectomy, and I've done thousands in my lifetime. Very, very common operation. Now, the dangerous part of acute cholecystitis is sometimes those stones, particularly the small stones. The big stones are a pain in your side, but it's the tiny stones. They can drop down the bile duct, the common bile duct. And remember, the pancreatic duct, right where it enters the gut, joins the bile duct. And if those little stones wedge, typically in the narrowest part, which is called the ampulla of Vater, or the little valve that lets bile squirt into the intestine, they lodge right there and they block the pancreatic duct and they block the bile duct. Now you've got this backup of bile into your liver because it can't flow freely into the intestine. And guess what? That's when you start getting jaundiced. And if it blocks the pancreatic duct, now you've got all these enzymes that break down food building up in the pancreas, and they start affecting and chewing up the pancreas, and you've got pancreatitis. Pancreatic gallstone pancreatitis and common bile duct blockade with jaundice are life-threatening diseases. People die every year of those diseases. So it's essential that we dislodge or get that little stone out of the duct. So anytime I do a gallbladder operation, I'm taking out the factory, but I also just check to make sure there's not a residual stone. And if there is a residual stone, any from 1 to 5% of people have a residual stone, we then go down with a light from above called an ERCP. And we can put a little wire or a basket up the bile duct and we can pull that stone out. Much safer than to do it surgically. Can we do it surgically? Absolutely. But the damage to the duct is much greater, and it's just simpler to do an ERCP. Be that as it may, that's the evolution of gallstones. So gallstones do not come from saturated fat. They come from chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption, insulin resistance, dysregulation of the negative feedback pathway of cholesterol production, supersaturated bile that then crystallizes out in the gallbladder. Not difficult to understand if you have an open mind. But if you're closed-minded about the fact that it's cholesterol in our diet, dare I say, like the oxalates in our diet that cause all the problems, we don't understand that it's a production problem, not a consumption problem. And there's no correlation between the consumption of high cholesterol foods with gallstones. But there is a direct correlation between gallstone disease, cholesterol gallstone disease, and chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption, insulin resistance, diabetes, obesity. Fair, fat, fertile, 40, and female. Maybe the fertility one, gestational diabetes, might be there. PCOS, not so much. Separate topic. So the point is that it's carbohydrates that cause the production by that dysregulation. And it's insulin resistance that does that. In the same way, in exactly the same pathway that insulin resistance affects the production of all the steroid hormones. Because the precursor of all the steroid hormones is cholesterol. So it affects progesterone, it affects estrogen, testosterone, human growth hormone, cortisol, vitamin D3 levels. All of those are mixed in. Now, let's look at the question I get so often. I've had my gallbladder taken out, I had it surgically removed, and my doctor told me not to eat fat. So wrong. Such garbage. First of all, your production of bile hasn't changed. Your liver's still pouring a ton of bile out. It's still making bile. It's just not storing it in the gallbladder. But here's the point. If you've got gallstone disease, if your gallbladder was taken out because of gallstones, they didn't happen the day before you got sick. They've been there for years, for months and years. You just didn't know about it, folks. That gallbladder has been dysfunctional for a long time. So taking a dysfunctional gallbladder out has no effect on your ability to absorb fat. If you were able to absorb fat before and you ate fatty foods, probably in the form of a pizza rather than a piece of ribeye steak, be that as it may, that fat is still being absorbed absolutely fine. Now, what you may find without a gallbladder is if you eat a ton of fat, you may get some diarrhea, you may get fatty, floaty stools. Like, remember that weight loss medication called Ali or Orlistat that was a fat blocker, blocked fat absorption, and the side effect was beware of fecal seepage? You may get a little bit of fecal seepage if you peg out on fat. But your fat absorption doesn't change because it's been broken for a long, long time and you've already adapted to it. So right after a cholecystectomy, for a few days, I'd probably not eat a lot of food in general, let alone fat. But once you're stable, once you've recovered from the surgery, test it. Some people will find they can eat fat, some people can't. My gallbladder is absolutely fine. There are certain fats that I can't eat. Don't be afraid of eating fat because you've had a cholecystectomy. And if your doctor tells you that, they do not understand the problem. They're already biased against saturated fat because it caused your gallstones. No, it didn't. It was your sugar and starch. But the final point I'm going to make here is this. Gallstone disease is one of the commonest prices, first prices that people pay for their addiction to carbohydrates. If you have gallbladder disease, if you've got cholesterol gallbladder disease, you are paying a profound price for your addiction to carbohydrates. Because it's not a little bit, it's chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption that causes gallbladder disease. So use that as a warning signal, because worse things are to come. Get away from carbohydrates if you can. You've paid the price as you're lying there recovering from your gallstone surgery, and it's a pretty innocuous surgery, but as you're lying there recovering, eat fat as you can. Test it out. Now, don't start with a bottle of olive oil, but eat fat, see how you feel. You shouldn't feel any different. Don't let your doctor put fear into you that you shouldn't eat fat. In fact, it's the thing that we want you to eat. We want you to eat cholesterol. We want you to eat fat. But stay away from the sugar, folks. You've paid the price once. How many more prices are you going to pay, sacrificing your health, sacrificing your life, to the God of carbohydrates, to that incredibly pleasurable drug? How often are you going to pray at that altar? Oh, I need my sugar, can't live without it. Okay, there are worse things to come than your gallbladder surgery. Please leave comments, but be factual, don't be critical. If I've made you think I've done my job, if this gives you perspective, again, I've done my job. But we really have to change the foundation of our thinking when it comes to what sugar and starch does versus when it comes to things that we've been doing forever are now suddenly causing harm. Use logic, use science, and you'll understand the body extremely well. I am the Carb Addiction Doc. Follow me on YouTube. Please subscribe to this channel if you like this video. Share it with your friends. We are on YouTube. We are on Instagram. And if you like the content and find value in it, buy us a cup of coffee on Patreon. Because these videos are free because of your contributions. And it's a charitable organization. They don't come to me. Thanks so much.